1891, Chicago workers dug beneath their own streets. What they found wasn't sewer lines. It was another city, fully intact, perfectly aligned, built before the people who lived above it. And then, in 1893, the excavations quietly stopped. No explanation, no public report, just silence. Between 1871 and 1893, Chicago underwent one of the most aggressive urban excavation projects in American history. The official reason? Raising the street grade to improve drainage. But photographs from that period tell a different story. They show workers uncovering tunnels, transit systems, foundations, entire basement levels with windows, doorways, and architectural detail, structures that weren't supposed to be there. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand three things. 1. What they actually found beneath Chicago. 2. Why the excavation records stop abruptly in the early 1890s. And 3. What this pattern reveals about the timeline we've been taught, because Chicago wasn't the only city digging. Seattle, Boston, New York, San Francisco, all within the same 20-year window, all finding the same thing. But that's not the strangest part. Let's start with what we're told. In the mid-1800s, Chicago had a drainage problem. The city was built on marshland near Lake Michigan. Streets flooded regularly. Sewage didn't drain. So the city council approved a plan. Raise the street level by 4 to 14 feet across downtown. Buildings would either be lifted with jackholes, yes, literally jacked up on screws, or left at their original level with new streets built above them. It's an extraordinary engineering feat, no question. And that part is documented. We have the engineering records, we have the invoices, we have photographs of buildings mid-lift. But here's the problem. Those records only explain what they did with buildings that already existed above ground. They don't explain what was already below. In 1889, the Chicago Tribune ran a brief article about excavation work on Dearborn Street. Workers reported finding old masonry structures 12 feet below the planned dig depth. The article is 3 paragraphs, no follow-up. But here's what makes it strange. The masonry was described as old in 1889. Chicago was officially incorporated in 1837. The city's first major construction boom didn't happen until the 1840s and 50s. So if structures found in 1889 were already considered old by the workers, how old were they? And why were they 12 feet below the planned excavation depth, not just below the raised streets, but below the original ground level? That's not a drainage solution, that's archaeology. And it wasn't just Dearborn Street. Between 1870 and 1892, excavation photographs show a recurring feature beneath Chicago's streets: brick-lined tunnels, arched ceilings, dimensions consistent with rail or transit use. Some of these tunnels were 10 to 15 feet below the pre-raised street level. Not sewer tunnels. The brickwork is too refined, the dimensions too large. They look like transit infrastructure. But according to the official record, Chicago's first subway system wasn't operational until 1943. So what were these tunnels for? And who built them? The photographs don't come with explanations, just images, filed away, archived. And here's the part that should concern you. There are no transit construction records in Chicago's city archives that match the age, depth, or design of these tunnels. They were already there, but that's not the strangest part. Look at this photograph, taken in 1891 during excavation work on State Street. You're looking at a building, 3 stories above ground, but notice the windows. They're not basement windows. They're full-sized, with decorative lintels, stone sills, glass panes, windows designed to let in natural light. Why would you install decorative windows below ground? You wouldn't, unless they weren't below ground when the building was constructed. Some researchers argue these buildings were constructed at a much lower elevation, and that sediment, mud, or some other material buried the lower floors over time. The official explanation is simpler. The buildings were simply built before the grade-raising project, and the lower floors became basements after streets were elevated. But here's the problem with that explanation. This building, the one in the photograph, has a cornerstone dated 1867. The Great Chicago Fire happened in 1871. The fire destroyed most of the city. Thousands of buildings burned. This one survived. And when excavation crews dug around it in 1891, they found another level, another set of windows, another floor, fully finished. Not a basement, not a foundation void, a functional floor, buried beneath mud. The Great Chicago Fire is one of the most documented disasters in American history. It started on October 8, 1871, burned for 2 days, destroyed over 3 square miles, killed an estimated 300 people. The official cause, a cow kicking over a lantern in a barn on DeKoven Street. Maybe, probably not, but that's the story. What matters is the aftermath. Chicago rebuilt, fast. Within 2 years, the downtown core was functionally restored. By 1880, it was unrecognizable from the pre-fire city. Impressive, no question. But here's what doesn't align. When excavation crews worked in the 1880s and 90s, they weren't digging through burned debris. They were digging through mud, packed mud, feet of it, covering lower-story windows, filling alleys, encasing foundations. If the city burned in 1871, where did all this mud come from? Rain doesn't do this. Flooding doesn't pack mud into second-story window frames and leave it hardened for 20 years. And if it was there before the fire, why is there no record of it? Why is there no mention in pre-1871 city planning documents of buildings half buried in sediment? The answer depends on when you think the mud arrived. And that question opens a door most historians refuse to walk through. Here's the pattern. From 1870 to 1892, Chicago's excavation projects were photographed regularly. Newspapers ran updates, engineers filed reports. Then in 1893, something changes. The World's Columbian Exposition opens in Chicago, the White City, an architectural marvel. Millions of visitors. Chicago is on the world stage, and the excavation photography stops, not gradually, abruptly. City planning documents from 1894 onward refer to completed grade improvements and move on to other infrastructure projects, but photographs from later years, 1900s, 1910s, show the same phenomenon. Buildings with half-buried windows, alleys filled with hardened sediment, tunnels still visible during new construction. The anomalies didn't disappear. The documentation did. Why? One possibility. The grade-raising project was simply completed, and there was no need for further excavation photography. Another possibility, what they found beneath Chicago between 1871 and 1893 raised questions the city's new image couldn't afford to answer. Because while the White City dazzled the world, there was another city underneath it, and that city didn't fit the narrative. Let's talk about what the evidence suggests. If we take the tunnel networks, the buried windows, the transit-aligned brick archways, and the sediment layers at face value, we're looking at urban infrastructure that predates the official timeline. Not by decades, by enough time for significant sediment accumulation. Natural sediment deposition in an urban environment is slow, 1 to 3 feet per century, depending on flooding and soil composition. But the Chicago excavation photos show 8 to 15 feet of packed mud covering functional architecture. That's not a generation. That's not even a century of slow accumulation. That's rapid deposition. Which brings us to the question no one in 1890s Chicago wanted to ask publicly. What kind of event deposits that much sediment, that fast across an entire urban grid, and then lets a new population move in and rebuild on top of it without record? Some researchers call it a mud flood. Others frame it as a seismic liquefaction event, an earthquake that turned soil into liquid, which then re-hardened. Others suggest intentional burial as part of a controlled reset. The common thread? All three theories acknowledge the same baseline reality. The infrastructure found beneath Chicago wasn't built by the people who raised the streets in the 1880s. It was inherited. And if that's true in Chicago, Where else is it true? Here's how you erase a mystery without erasing the evidence. You don't destroy the photographs. You file them. You don't deny the tunnels. You reclassify them as old sewer infrastructure and move on. You don't tear down the buildings with buried windows. You call them basements and let new owners renovate. And most importantly, you stop asking questions during a moment of transformation. 1893 was that moment for Chicago. The World's Fair wasn't just an event, it was a rebranding. Chicago went from a frontier boomtown that burned to the ground to a gleaming symbol of American progress. In that context, what do you do with evidence that suggests your city was built on top of another civilization? You don't publish it. You don't theorize about it in official records. You finish the excavation work. You pour concrete. You move forward. And the photographs? They go into the archives, where they sit for 100 years, until someone starts looking. Chicago wasn't alone. Seattle, 1889 to 1907. The city regrades entire neighborhoods, raising streets up to 35 feet. Workers uncover brick-lined tunnels and buried storefronts. Boston, 1870s to 1880s. Landfill projects to expand the Back Bay. Excavation crews find pre-existing granite foundations beneath the fill. San Francisco, 1906. After the earthquake, reconstruction crews dig through sediment layers covering older street grids. New York, 1900s to 1910s. Subway construction uncovers unexplained masonry chambers beneath Manhattan. Same 20-year window, same pattern, same official explanation, grade improvements. Same unanswered question, what's buried beneath them? And here's the part that should make you pause. The engineers who worked on these projects weren't fools. They saw what they were uncovering. They photographed it. They filed reports. But none of those reports say, we found a pre-existing civilization. They say, old infrastructure of unknown origin. And then the reports stop. So what did they find beneath Chicago? The evidence suggests three things. 1. A network of transit tunnels, aligned and brick-lined, that predate Chicago's official transportation history. 2. Buildings with multiple buried stories, suggesting rapid sediment accumulation over functional architecture. 3. A discontinuity in the documentary record that begins precisely when Chicago steps onto the global stage in 1893. Does that mean Chicago was built on top of a lost civilization? Not necessarily, but it does mean the timeline we've been taught. The neat narrative of frontier town to modern city in 50 years doesn't account for what the excavation crews actually found. And it means someone, at some point, decided those findings weren't worth explaining. Because in 1893, Chicago had a story to tell. The story of progress, modernity, the American future, and a buried city that wasn't part of the story. But here's the question we haven't asked yet. If this infrastructure was already there in 1871, who used it and where did they go? The photographs show the tunnels. They show the buildings. They show the mud. But they don't show the people. Next time, we're going below the basements, into the tunnels themselves, and we're asking the question no one in 1893 wanted answered: who lived here first?